talk to you. You didn't expect me today.
No.
I meant to go to Washington to see you. I'd made all the arrangements. I very nearly crossed you in the train. You know, I hardly remembered you.
Hardly remembered me?
I mean, how shall I explain? It's always so. Each time you happen to me all over again.
Oh, yes, I know. I know.
Does it? Do I too? To you? Ellen.
What a pretty carriage. Is it May's?
Yes.
Oh. Then it was she who sent you to fetch me. How kind of her.
You must see that this can't last.
What can't?
Our being together and not together.
No. You ought not to have come today.
Don't be afraid of me. You needn't squeeze yourself back into your corner like that. A stolen kiss isn't what I want. Don't suppose I don't understand your reasons for not wanting to let this feeling between us dwindle into some ordinary hole-in-corner love affair. I couldn't have spoken this way yesterday. Because when we've been apart and I'm looking forward to seeing you, every thought is burnt up in a great flame. But then you come, and you're so much more than I expected. And what I want of you is so much more than an hour or two every now and then, with wastes of thirsty waiting between. That I can sit here beside you, perfectly still, like this, with that other vision in my mind, just quietly trusting to it to come true.
What do you mean by trusting it to come true?
Why, you know it will, don't you?
A vision of you and I together. You choose your place well to put it to me.
Do you mean because we're in my wife's carriage? Shall we get out and walk, then?
No. I shan't get out and walk. Because my business is to see my family. And you and I will sit together. And we'll look, not at visions, but at realities.
I don't know what you mean by realities. The only reality to me is this.
Is it your idea, then, that I should live with you as your mistress, since I can't be your wife?
I want somehow to get away with you into a world where words like that, categories like that won't exist. Where we shall be simply two human beings who love each other, who are the whole of life to each other, and nothing else on earth will matter.
Oh, my dear. Where is that country? Have you ever been there? So many people have tried to find it. And they all got out by mistake at wayside stations, places like Monte Carlo, Pisa, Bologna. It wasn't at all different than the old world that they'd left. Only rather dingier and smaller and more promiscuous. Oh, leave me at a miserable little country.
Then what exactly is your plan for us?
For us? But there is no us in that sense. We're near each other only if we stay away from each other. Then we can be ourselves. Otherwise, we're only Newland Archer, the husband of Ellen Olenska's cousin, and Ellen Olenska, the cousin of Newland Archer's wife, trying to be happy behind the backs of people that trust us.
I'm beyond that.
No, you're not. You've never been beyond that, and I have. I know what it looks like there. You don't. What are you doing?
I must get out of here. You're right. I ought not to have come for you today.
I love the Countess Ellen Olenska. But of course, I was nothing like her. She's exotic, beautiful, and well. But by creating Ellen, by creating all my characters, I was able to live a second life, a third, many lives. They were born of my brain, and my stories always seemed to me more real than life. As a child, I was enthralled by words. It mattered very little whether I understood them or not. The sound was the essential thing. Wherever I went, they sang to me like birds in an enchanted forest. And they sang so bewitchingly that they almost lured me from the wholesome noonday air of childhood into some strange supernatural region. Though they held literature in great esteem, my parents stood in nervous dread of those who produced it. On the whole, my mother doubtless thought it would be simpler if the people one might be exposed to meeting would refrain from meddling with literature. So you see, when I wrote about Ellen Olenska, a woman once respectable, a bohemian even, who had lived amongst other artists, a woman who had once put herself beyond the pale, perhaps I was wondering whether I could live like that, pay that price. That was the age of innocence. Ah, the miserable poverty of any love that lies outside of marriage, of any love that is not a living together, a sharing of all. Ellen and I were both innocent daughters of that age. When my grandfather died, my father came into an independent fortune. But even before that, my father and my uncle seem to have had an allowance permitting them to lead a life of leisure and amiable hospitality. The customs of the day were simple, and in my father's set, the chief diversions were deep-sea fishing and wild fowl shooting. I have often sighed, in looking back at my childhood, to think how pitiful a provision was made for the life of the imagination behind those uniform brownstone facades. Beauty, passion, and danger were automatically excluded from our lives, for the men were almost as starved as the women, and the average human being deprived of air from the heights is likely to produce other lives equally starved. My childhood and growth were an intellectual desert. Fate had planted me in New York, and by instinct as a storyteller counseled me to use the material closest to hand and most familiarly my own, fashionable New York. There it was before me in all its flatness and futility, asking to be dealt with as the theme most available to my hand, since I have been steeped in it since infancy. I'll have tea in the salon in half an hour. Yes, and yet the problem was how to extract from such a subject the typical human significance which is the storyteller's reason for telling one story rather than another. The answer was that a frivolous society can acquire dramatic significance only through what its frivolity destroys. Its tragic implication lies in its power to debase not only its people, but their ideals. The answer, in short, was my heroine, Lily Bart, and the House of Mirth.
3:30.
Thank you.
There was nothing new about Lily Bart. Yet I could never see her without a faint movement of interest. It was characteristic of her that she always roused speculation. That even her simplest acts seemed the result of far-reaching intentions. Everything about Lily Bart was at once vigorous and exquisite. at once strong and fine. I had the confused sense that she must have cost a great deal to make, that a great many dull and ugly people must, in some mysterious way, have been sacrificed to make her.
Mr. Selden, what good luck. How nice of you to come to my rescue. I have 2 hours to wait for my train to the Trenners. I don't know what to do with myself. Let's walk a little. Oh, you never come and call. And yet we get on so well when we meet.
Well, perhaps that's the reason.
I wish I knew. I wish I could make you out. Of course, I know there are men who don't like me. One can tell at a glance. And there are others who are afraid of me. I think I want to marry them. But I don't think you dislike me. And you can't possibly think that I want to marry you.
No, I absolve you of that.
Well, then.
Well, then, perhaps that's the reason.
What?
That you don't want to marry me. Perhaps I don't regard it as such a strong inducement to go and see you.
Oh, dear Mr. Selden. That was unworthy of you.
It's stupid of you to make love to me, and it's not like you to be stupid. Don't you see that there are men enough to say pleasant things to me? And that what I want is a friend who won't be afraid to say disagreeable ones when I need them. Sometimes I've fancied that you might be that friend. I don't know why, except that you're neither prig nor bounder. And that I shouldn't have to pretend with you or be on my guard against you. You have no idea how I need such a friend. My aunt is full of copybook axioms that were meant to apply to conduct in the early 1850s. And the other women, my best friends, well, they use me or abuse me, but they don't care a straw what happens to me. I've been about too long. People are growing tired of me. They're beginning to say I ought to marry.
Well, why don't you?
Oh! I see you are a friend after all. And that is one of the disagreeable things I was asking for.
It wasn't meant to be disagreeable.
Oh.
Isn't marriage your vocation? Isn't it what you're all brought up for?
I suppose so. What else is there?
Exactly. So why not take the plunge and have it over?
You speak as if I ought to marry the first man who came along.
I didn't mean to imply that you're as hard put to it as that. But there must be someone with the requisite qualification.
I threw away 1 or 2 good chances when I first came out. I suppose every girl does. And you know, I'm horribly poor and very expensive. I must have a great deal of money. You love to read. Don't you ever mind not being rich enough to buy all the books that you want?
Don't I just? You take me for a saint on a pillar?
And having to work. Do you mind that?
Well, the work itself's not so bad. I'm quite fond of the law.
No. But the being tied down, the routine. Don't you ever just want to get away? See new places and people.
Especially when I see my friends rushing off to the steamer.
But do you mind enough to marry to get out of it?
God forbid.
That's the difference. A girl must. A man may. If he chooses. Your coat's a little shabby, but who cares? It doesn't stop someone from asking you to dine. If I was shabby, no one would have me. A woman has asked as much for her clothes as for herself. The clothes are the background. The frame, if you like. They don't make success, but they are part of it. Who wants a dingy woman? We're expected to be pretty and well-dressed till we drop. And if we can't keep it up alone, we have to go into partnership.
I cannot remember the time, as a child, when I did not want to make up stories. At any moment, the impulse might seize me. And then, if there was a book within reach, I had only to walk the floor, turning the pages as I walked, to be swept off full sail in a sea of dreams. My first attempt at writing came at the age of 11. It was a novel, and it began, "Oh, how do you do, Mrs. Brown?" said Mrs. Tompkins. If only I had known you were coming, I'd have tidied up the drawing room. Timorously, I submitted this to my mother, and never shall I forget the icy comment, "Drawing rooms are always tidy." This was so crushing to a would-be novelist of manners that it shook me rudely out of my dream of writing fiction, and I took to writing poetry instead. I was never free from the oppressive sense that I had two absolutely inscrutable beings to please, God and my mother, who, while ostensibly upholding the same principles of behavior, differed totally as to their application, and my mother was the most inscrutable of the two. I was starving for mental nourishment. There was no measure to my appetite. There was in me some hidden need to order my thoughts, a need which developed almost as early as the desire to be kissed and thought pretty. It originated perhaps in the sense that weighed on my whole childhood, the sense of bewilderment, of the need of guidance, of the longing to understand what it was all about. My little corner of the cosmos seemed like a dark and trackless region, and I was oppressed by the sense that I was too small and ignorant and alone ever to find my way about in it. Once, when, in a moment of unheard of audacity, I sent a poem to a newspaper, I wrote to the editor apologizing for the fact that my meter was irregular, but adding firmly that though I was only a little girl, I wished this irregularity to be respected as it was intentional. The editor published the poem and wrote back politely, saying that he had no objection to irregular meter himself. Young Vance Weston, from my novel, Hudson River Bracketed. He, too, discovers the sound of noble verse, and although still too young to fully appreciate it, the joy of having someone to share it with.
In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alph the sacred river ran, through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. This was a new music, a music utterly unknown to me, but to which the hidden chords of my soul at once vibrated. This was something for me, something that intimately belonged to me. What had I ever known of poetry before? Oh, who wrote this?
Who wrote that? Why, Coleridge, of course. Through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea.
I had heard the of course, but without heeding it. All I cared for was that she had given me the man's name, the man who had imagined that. My brain was reeling as if I were drunk.
Vance Weston. And Halo Spear, who unfortunately is all too soon to be Halo Tarrant, Mrs. Lewis Tarrant. The Spears of old Lawburn blood no longer have the money to support the kind of life they have become used to living. And Lewis Tarrant, who is looking for a wife, certainly does have the money and seems a kind enough man. Ah, life and love. Halo and I both longed for poetry and a passion bound together. A man and a woman reaching out to each other, sharing at one and the same time that unutterable music. Well. And then there was Teddy. My husband was 13 years older than myself. There was, of course, no question of his ever having to work, for he, like my father and uncles, was born to wealth and loved to fish. On a few days before my marriage, I was seized with such dread of the dark mystery that I summoned up courage once again to appeal to my mother and begged her to tell me what being married was like. With icy disapproval, which I most dreaded, she replied I never heard such a ridiculous question. Instantly, I felt how vulgar she thought me. However, with the extremity of my need, I persisted. At first, she was silent. Then she said, with effort, "You've seen enough pictures and statues in your life. Haven't you noticed that men are made differently from women?" Yes, I faltered. Well, for heaven's sake, don't ask me any more stupid questions. You can't be as silly as you pretend. That was it. I was convicted of stupidity for not knowing what I had been expressly forbidden to ask about or even think of. I was left with a penetrating sense of not niceness. And that was literally all I knew of the process of germination until I had been married to Teddy for 2 weeks and 5 days. My mother's inability to offer me any aid or advice did more than anything else to falsify and misdirect my entire life. One day, I decided to send 3 of my poems to 3 of the leading magazines of the day. A week or 2 elapsed, and then I received the 3 answers telling me that all 3 of my poems had been accepted. As long as I live, I shall always remember my sensations when I opened the first of the 3 letters and learned that I was to appear in print. I can still see the narrow hall, the letterbox out of which I fished the letters, and the flight of stairs up and down which I ran senselessly and incessantly in the attempt to give my excitement some muscular outlet. Ask Anna to send this to Mr. Scribner.
course, the doing of the decoration of houses amused me very much, but it can hardly be regarded as part of my literary career. That began with the publishing of 2 or 3 short stories.
The fullness of life. I have sometimes thought that a woman's nature is like a great house full of rooms. There is the hall, through which everyone passes, going in and out. The drawing room where one receives formal visits. The sitting room where the members of the family come and go as they list. But beyond that, far beyond, are other rooms, the handles of whose doors perhaps are never turned. No one knows the way to them. No one knows whither they lead. And in the innermost room, the Holy of Holies, the soul sits alone and waits for a footstep that never comes.
As for the old stories, I regard them as the excesses of youth. They were written at the top of my voice. The fullness of life is one long shriek. The stories attracted attention, but they brought me no nearer to other workers in the same field. I continued to live my old life, for my husband was as fond of society as ever, and I knew of no other existence, except in our annual escapes to Italy. As yet, I had no real personality of my own. For 12 years, I seldom knew what it was to be for more than an hour or two out of the 24 without the most intense feeling of nausea and such unutterable fatigue that when I got up, I was always more tired than when I lay down. This form of neurasthenia consumed the best years of my youth and has left in some sort an irreparable shade on my life. My seasickness defied all cures, but I must return to the greater inclination and my discovery of that soul of mine which the publication of my first volume called to life. At last, I had groped my way through to my vocation, and thereafter I never questioned that storytelling was my job. Unfortunately, the people about me were so indifferent to everything I really cared for. And it was only some years later, when I had written several books, that I finally rebelled and pleaded for the right to something better. There was no cruelty and no unkindness in Teddy. Yet he was cruel and unkind through weakness. You do remember Halo, don't you? Halo Tarrant?
I have at last seen the light of day, and moved from the mist of illusion I have tried to create about my marriage. Never again will I see Louis save as he is, and yet, just as inevitably, will I also see myself chained to him for life. The fact that he has reminded me of my obligations makes it perpetually present to me. The new carpets at Eaglewood, my parents' flat in New York, my mother's black velvet, my father's cigars. These are the links of my chain, and they hold me as tight as if divorce had never existed. For I know now that Louis's generosity, yes, he was generous, had proceeded not from his heart, but from his head. He wanted me, I suited him, and he has bought me. It was no more romantic than that. And being a gentleman, he has punctiliously paid the annual tax of his acquisition and will continue to do so as long as I continue to suit him. And it is my business to go on suiting him, is it not? Since the day I cease to, my parents' household will fall to pieces. I must make my submission now. For escape being impossible, common sense tells me I must make the best of my fate. And something higher than common sense tells me, after all, I am only paying my dues.
Lily Bart was a victim, and so too, for the moment, seems Halo, the daughters of cautious and conservative old New York. But in the custom of the country, Undine Spragg comes from the west, a new breed like a spring storm, determined to use life in the same way her middle-class male counterparts use it. And her husband, Ralph Marvel, a son of New York society, is as ill prepared for the new and changing America as Teddy. Today is his son's birthday. He has spent hours with his family waiting for his wife to join the party, has given up and returned home in despair.
Well,
They waited for you all afternoon in Washington Square. The boy never had his birthday.
why? What happened? Why didn't the nurse take him?
They thought you were going to fetch him, so they waited.
But I telephoned.
Where from?
Why, the studio, of course. The sitting lasted longer than usual. There was something about the dress he couldn't get.
But I thought he was giving a tea.
He had tea afterwards. He always does. And then he asked some people in to see my portrait. That detained me, too.
The nurse never got any message. My people were awfully disappointed, and the poor boy cried his eyes out.
Dear me. Oh, what a fuss. Oh, I might have known my message wouldn't be delivered. Everything always happens to put me in the wrong with your family.
Did you just come from the studio?
Yes. It's awfully late. I must go and dress. We're dining with the Ellings, you know.
Yes, I know. How did you come, in a cab?
No, I couldn't find one that would take me. So Peter Van Degen gave me a lift like an angel and blew him to bits. He had his open car. Is that all?
Yes. You'd better go and dress. The turnings of life seldom show a signpost. Or rather, though the sign is always there, it's usually placed some distance back. Like the notices that give warning of a bad hill or a railway crossing. For years, I've been walking with a ghost. A ghost of my own illusion. Only somehow I've vivified it, colored it, substantiated it by the force of my own great need. The way a man might breathe a semblance of life into a dear drowned body he can't give up for dead. This came to me as the joyless solace of the morning. Last the bandage is off and I can see. And what do I see? Only the uselessness of driving my wife to subterfuges that are no longer necessary. Is Peter Van Degen her lover? Probably not. Undine won't take any more risks than she can help. And it is admiration, not love, that she wants. She wants to enjoy herself. And her conception of enjoyment is publicity, promiscuity. The crowd, the band, the banners. The close contact of covetous impulses. And the sense of walking among them in cool security. Any personal entanglement for her would mean bother. And bother is the thing she most abhors. Probably, as the queer formula goes, my honor is safe. I can count on the letter of her fidelity. At the moment, the conviction means no more to me than if you assure me of the honesty of the first stranger I meet this morning in the street. A stranger. That's what she's become for me. So malleable on the outside. She has remained insensible to the touch of the heart. And yet, the woman I turn from now is still my wife, still the mother of my son. We are, after all, fellow victims in the noyade of marriage. If we cease to struggle, perhaps the drowning will be easier. For both of us.
My literary success puzzled and embarrassed my old friends far more than it impressed them. And in my own family, it created a kind of constraint, which increased with the years. None of my relations ever spoke to me of my books, either to praise or to blame. They simply ignored them. The subject was avoided as though it were some sort of family disgrace. We sold our Newport house and built one near Lenox, in the hills of western Massachusetts. And at last escape watering place trivialities for the real country. On a slope overlooking the dark waters and densely wooded shores of Laurel Lake, we built our spacious and dignified house. The Mount was my first real home. Here, for 10 years, I lived and gardened and wrote contentedly, and should doubtless have ended my days here, had not a grave change in my husband's health made the burden of the property too heavy. In 1906, we decided to exchange our little house in New York for a flat in Paris. My husband suffered increasingly from the harsh winds and sudden temperatures of the New York winter. We still came home every summer to the Mount. But much as I loved the place, the glowing summer weeks, the woodland pageantry of our matchless New England autumn, it was all darkened by my husband's growing ill health. Since the first years of marriage, his condition, in spite of intervals of apparent health, had become steadily graver. Teddy's sweetness of temper and boyish enjoyment of life struggled along against the creeping darkness of neurasthenia. But all the neurologists we consulted were of the opinion that there could be no real recovery, and time confirmed their verdict. I began Ethan Frome in France. I am very fond of Ethan Frome.
If you know Starkfield, Massachusetts, you know the post office. If you know the post office, you must have seen Ethan Frome drive up to it, drop the reins on his hollowback bay, and drag himself across the brick pavement to the white colonnade. and you must have asked yourself who he was. It was there that several years ago I saw him for the first time, and the sight pulled me up sharp. Even then, he was the most striking figure in Starkfield, though he was but the ruin of a man. In Starkfield, the silence had deepened about him year by year. Left alone after his father's accident to carry the burden of farm and mill, he had no time for anybody. When his mother fell ill, the loneliness of the house grew more oppressive than that of the fields. His mother had been a talker in her day, but after her trouble, the sound of her voice was seldom heard, though she had not lost the power of speech. Sometimes in the long winter evenings, when in desperation her son asked her why she didn't say something, she would lift a finger and answer, "Because I'm listening." And on stormy nights, when the wind was about the house, she would complain if he spoke to her. "They're talking so out there that I can't hear you." It was only when she drew toward her last illness and his cousin, Zenobia Pierce, came over from the next valley to help nurse her, that the sound of human speech was heard in the house again. After the mortal silence of his long imprisonment, Zena's constant chatter was music in his ears. He felt he might have gone like his mother if the sound of a new voice had not come to steady him. The mere fact of obeying her orders, of feeling free to go about his business again and talk with other men, restored his shaken balance and magnified his sense of what he owed her. After the funeral, when he saw her preparing to go away, he was seized with an unreasoning dread of being left alone on the farm. And before he knew what he was doing, he had asked her to stay there with him. He had often thought since that it would not have happened if his mother had died in the spring instead of winter. And within a year of their marriage, Zenobia developed the sickliness which had since made her notable, even in a community rich in pathological instances. Then, she too fell silent.
I know, Teddy, we all know that you are not well, and that anything in the nature of a nervous breakdown is hard to struggle against. But you're a perfectly reasonable being, and capable of the struggle, and of seeing how impossible it is for anyone to help you if you won't make the first effort yourself. In 1908, I began a journal, a very private journal. For I, too, discovered the love that lies outside of marriage. It snowed the day before MF arrived at the Mount. We sat together on that wet bank in the woods and smoked a cigarette while the chains were put on the wheels of the motor car. And then, in February, in Europe, my dear MF, I thought after all I had been mistaken. And my poor close barred its shutters and bolted its doors again, and the dust gathered and the cobwebs thickened in the empty rooms where, for a moment, I had heard an echo. In the church, it was still and dim, and in the shadowy corner where I sat while you talked with the curé, a veiled figure stole up and looked at me a moment. Was its name Happiness? I dare not lift the veil.
The other night at the theater, when you came into the box, that dim little bag noir, number 13, I shall always remember. I felt for the first time that indescribable current of communication flowing between myself and someone else. Felt it, I mean, uninterruptedly, securely, so that it penetrated every sense and every thought. And I said to myself, this must be what happy women feel. I have drunk of the wine of life at last. I have known the thing best worth knowing. I have been warmed through and through, never to grow quite cold again, till the end. A writer will never do his best until he ceases altogether to think of his readers, and his editor, and his publisher, and begins to write not for himself, but for that other self with whom the creative artist is always in mysterious correspondence. The creative imagination can make a little go a long way. One good heartbreak will furnish the poet with many songs, and the novelist with a considerable number of novels. But they must have hearts that can break.
Mrs. Vance Weston?
No.
Mrs. Vance Weston.
No.
Mrs. Vance Weston?
No. Yes. Stupid. So incredibly stupid. But it is the first time the name has been given to me, and it is not true. I'm not yet Mrs. Vance Weston, but Halo Tarrant, the still undivorced wife of Louis Tarrant. I do not know when I will be free, and I quite dislike masquerading under a name to which I have no right. And yet, before my own conscience and my lover's, I am already what I call myself, his wife. For if I am not Vance Weston's for always, the future is already a handful of splinters.
Dear Mrs. Tarrant, I have just heard that your husband knows of your plans and is not disposed to consent to your divorcing him if you persist in leaving the country in the circumstances of which you have advised me. Indeed, I suspect he may refuse to take divorce proceedings himself simply in order to prevent your remarrying. I earnestly beg you, if my messenger reaches you before you are actually off.
Louis is a man who grows fat on resentment, as others do on happiness. This is the man I've lived with for 10 years. He has always been what he is now, and I have always known it. Does he really imagine that I will give up a year, perhaps 2 years, of happiness, of life? Life at last. To sit in conventional solitude till the divorce, conducted, of course, with old-fashioned discretion and deliberation, permits him to posture before his little world as the husband who so chivalrously allows an unworthy but unblamed wife to gain her liberty. My life has finally struck root in the soul depths, while his uneasily flutters on the surface. I am beyond all reach of malice. Every artist works like the Gobelin weavers on the wrong side of the tapestry. And if from time to time he comes around to the right side and catches what seems a happy glow of color or a firm sweep of design, he must instantly retreat again, if encouraged, yet still uncertain.
The business of the artist is to make laugh and not to laugh, to make weep and not to weep. And unless those tears and laughter and flesh and blood are transmuted by him into the substance that art works in, they are nothing to his purpose or to ours. The world is a welter and has always been one. The welter is always there. And the present generation hears close underfoot the growling of the volcano upon which ours danced so long. But in our individual lives, though the years are sad, the days have a way of being jubilant. Life is the saddest thing there is next to death. And yet there are always new countries to see, new books to read, and I hope to write. 1,000 little daily wonders to marvel at and rejoice in. One way of finding out whether a risk is worth taking is not to take it, and then see what one becomes in the long run. I left the Vaud for France in 1911. I left the mortal solitude of my life with Teddy soon after. I returned to America only once, in 1923.